So Maureen, round two for you and I. It's
2.5 really, right?
a half. Yes, we tried one last week to try to do this last week, and all of a sudden somebody hit a transformer in my area and knocked off the power. So it didn't really work. And I see, do we still have Stella with us?
We have her, she's on my lap again.
So she hasn't been there the whole time since the last time we talked.
No.
I appreciate you coming back, because I do think that there are some things that I would like to pursue, especially in relation to poverty. Three things really. But the first one I was going to ask you was, you know, when we were on the mayor's panel 5-6 years ago, so many people came to us. You know, it was 1,000 people in groups overall that came over that 7-month period. Yeah. And, you know, we heard a lot of things that people felt needed to be done. And then, of course, it went to council, and council passed it unanimously. Now, of course, things have to work out through the infrastructure of the city and other groups. But is it your sense that the poverty file has kind of spun out of control since that time, 5-6 years ago? Or do you still think we're kind of on it and are managing it?
I think the big focus right now is housing.
Mm-hmm.
So our panel took that more holistic approach, and rightfully so, because it's also connected. You know that better than I do. The connection between all sorts of things, food insecurity and employment and economic recovery. At that time, we were still talking about the economic recovery from the 2008 recession. We were still talking about that back in 2015. Yeah. And so I think right now, those other pieces are not as big a part of the conversation right now as maybe they should be. And it's all about housing. And I get that as well. The housing part, we're getting a lot of funding from the other levels of government. There is a big push across the board for housing. And housing is that, as much as they are all connected, I feel like housing is that one piece that can be the catalyst to get the other pieces in place. If people are not adequately housed, if they're not safe and warm and secure, it's very difficult to get all of the other things in place.
Yeah, and it seems to me that a lot of things have added to that. It could be property rates, you know, it could be unemployment. There's just so many things that have changed in the last 5 years, and especially in the last 2 with COVID. But the most expensive thing of all, really, in the end, especially in capital items, is housing. And I think it's maybe one of the reasons why it's remained unaddressed so long, is because it really does require a certain coordination amongst the 3 jurisdictions, 3 levels of government, or it's just not going to happen. And if all of a sudden through society, there's a surge of people that are suddenly needing it, and the 3 levels have to suddenly try to get that together and work on it, it's going to take time for that to work through the system. And I guess that's kind of where we're at now. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. You know, Glenn, during our panel work, I went to Toronto and I met with the late Pam McConnell, who was the deputy mayor of Toronto, and she was the council lead for their poverty reduction strategy. Yeah. She was so gracious and generous with her time. She spent an entire day with me, the first half just talking to me, talking about what they did and how they got to where they were. And then the second half of the day was meeting with her staff. So it was very different from how we did it in London. We had no budget, as you know, in London. And we had Lynn Livingston was the managing director of the area City Hall that was working on these issues. Now she's city manager, but she was the staff lead on it. And they were working off the sides of their desks. They were working, I was saying at the time, 2 full-time jobs, because the poverty panel work was a full-time job. And then they had their other jobs, her and her staff. So, but in Toronto, it started out as a staff-driven thing, and it worked that way for a year. Then they went to the mayor and they said, we need to bring in the political side. And we sort of did it backwards again in London. We've started at the political side. So they brought the deputy mayor in to lead it on the political side, and they worked together for another year. So when I talked to her, I was very proud of what we had accomplished, because we met with more people. We had more engagement over 7 months compared to what they did over 2 years in Toronto. What they did was very, very good and very successful, but I wish we had the budget and the political will to put the money in the way they had done in Toronto. But regardless, we should be really proud at what we accomplished. But one thing that Pam told me that day was, what did she say? A wave like this, and at that time, the governments were very focused on poverty reduction, the federal and provincial governments, and especially child poverty.
Yeah.
So they were giving funding to municipal governments. They were trying to do things about it. And she said, a wave like this comes along about once every 10 years. And when it comes, you ride it as long as you can. And so as the focus and talk about poverty reduction and the panel and everything was starting to wane, I had feared that wave was over. And it seemed like the wave was coming down. And I think what COVID has done is ramped it way back up again, like more so than it ever was when we were doing the poverty panel work. And I was at a Black History Month event virtual that Ariel Kayabaga had hosted. She had Mitzi Hunter there. She had Jean Augustine and a number of other very amazing, prominent women politicians and advocates and leaders. She had the president and CEO of LHSC was one of her panelists as well. I can't remember her name. She was amazing. But one of the guests said that COVID didn't necessarily cause the problems that we're seeing now in poverty and homelessness and inequity and things like that. It just brought it into really sharp relief. The focus has really been on some of these social issues that have always been there, simmering beneath the surface. But COVID has made everybody look at it and say, holy cow, this is what's going on.
Yeah.
And the governments of the day are looking to do something about it, which is really good. So it's a big wave, and I think we got to ride it. We have to get on our surfboards and get on the top of that wave.
So can you give us a Civics 101 lesson? So when we were doing the panel those years ago, it wasn't just groups that met with us, groups that were helping with housing, and it was individuals too. Individual citizens were coming forward to say that they really felt that some of these issues needed to be worked on. And these issues end up coming to City Hall, informally or formally. Can you explain to us how it works through the process? I know in the time that I was in Ottawa, people just thought that they could talk to their MP and bang, that's all it took. The MP could talk to the Prime Minister and it would just get done. That's not the way it works at all. There's so many things that have to be gone through. How does it work at the city?
At the city, and when I talk to groups, I lament the fact that the municipal level has the least amount of attention and people are most apathetic. We have the lowest voter turnout at the municipal level, 39% in the last municipal election. And yet it has such a direct impact on people's day-to-day lives. And we are the most flexible of all three levels of government. We can do things rather quickly, and we can do things based off of direct citizen engagement. So somewhat related in the field of poverty strategies and things like that. We had a delegation come to us. There was a person who works at Virgin Radio, a representative from the Thames Valley School Board, like a youth representative. They came to City Hall and they said, this is what's happened at Western University. This is what's happened in the Thames Valley School Board and in some other jurisdictions. Organizations are making menstrual products available free of charge in public washrooms. And we really want the City of London to do the same thing in your buildings. And these are the reasons why. They talked about young girls and women, especially living in poverty, who miss about a week, a month of school because their families cannot afford these products. They're not cheap. And they're embarrassed to admit that. And I know the food bank regularly makes calls for these kinds of products because they are in such need. And so they made this delegation to a committee of council, the Community and Protective Services Committee, I believe it was. It might have been Corporate Services. And we had a brief discussion, and the committee recommended to the whole of council that staff go ahead and do, I think it was a 1-year pilot project, put these products in our publicly accessible buildings, and then come back with us after a year and tell us how it went. And it was a huge success. And now they are in all of our buildings that the city owns. And I recently had a delegate or an email come to me from an advocate in Hamilton asking, and I don't know why, sometimes you get these emails and I'm like, I don't know why they picked me. Maybe they sent it to all of the councillors. I don't know. How did you do it? What happened? We are getting some resistance from Hamilton City Council, and we want to see this happen in Hamilton. So I reached out to staff. I got all of the reports that had come forward, and then the one that costed it out. It was not a very high cost program. It's not high cost at all, and sent up all of that information to this advocate in Hamilton, and they were using the experience in London to try to make change there in Hamilton. So that's how accessible the municipal government can be compared to an MP and having to talk to the prime minister and make something happen.
Yeah, I know at the food bank, for instance, Mandy Fields, who works for Bell Media, she had started Camp on Tuesday a number of years ago, and it's now across the country. It would be tough to think that, you know, it's happening across the country, but not happening in London. So obviously City Hall listened to that and actually got behind it. So it's that kind of marriage, interesting marriage between civil society and the political side of things. I think that's so important. I do think that, you know, as the costs of poverty become greater, because, you know, if you handle poverty on the cheap, you'll never deal with it. It just doesn't happen. But as they become greater, the help of the senior levels of government become more important. And we've talked about this in our previous session. But what can civil society, and by that I mean organizations like the food bank or researchers or whatever it is, how can we help the city? Because the city has to then go down to Queen's Park, or they have to go up the 401 to Toronto, and you have to make your pitch.
Yeah,
it's necessary because they're the ones that control the levers of the economy and what cities can get. How can we help with that? I've sometimes wondered, I know my time in Ottawa, we've talked about this before, sometimes the civil society representation in the delegations that came to Ottawa wasn't very strong. It was primarily political of the people that came up. But what can we do to help the city? If it's really going to take that kind of partnership with the senior levels of government, we need to all be in on that and to fight for the kind of funding we require. How can we best work on that as a civil society? How can we help?
I think that joint advocacy is really important and really powerful. And so we also, as a municipality, we get funding through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for different programs. And we generally are competing with other municipalities for this specific program. So they'll set something up and they'll pick 5 or 6 municipalities to be a recipient of the money to run the program that they've envisioned, or they have a loose idea, and then they invite the cities to frame it for their own individual needs in their local communities. So at the FCM level, a lot of times these programs and these fundings, we've had great success in London when we go to FCM with somebody from the community, with an organization. So I participated in a pitch for what was it called? Diverse Voices for Change. And so it was coming through the Women in Civic, or the Increasing Women's Participation in Local Government Committee at FCM. That they were the ones that were putting this program together. They were giving it to 5 cities, and we made the pitch together with women in politics, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But Shauna Lukowitz was our partner on that, and we were successful in getting that program. And we geared our program around increasing women's participation on local boards here in London, local public boards and commissions. And we wanted something that we could measure the before and the after, and we did a scan of our local advisory committees and city boards like the library board and things like that, just to see what kind of diversity existed on the board, because they were looking for improvements in diversity and women from diverse backgrounds in particular. So I also think when you look at some of the city granting programs through the community grants program, they're looking for collaboration. And so I think the other levels of government as well look favorably upon that kind of collaboration, because as you know, poverty is a community problem, and no one level of government and no one organization is ever going to solve it. And the way we're going to have the best success is if we all work together to deliver that change. And so food bank, I think, working very closely with the city on those kinds of advocacy efforts at the other levels of government, I think they would look favorably upon that. And also, you have the expertise in that food ecosystem here in London, much better than anyone at City Hall, other than the ones most entrenched in these poverty reduction programs that are being run. But even then, I would say there's nobody at City Hall that has the expertise that you have at the food bank for what's going on there, food related in London.
So can I put you on the spot just a bit?
Maybe.
Would you say right now that the thing that the city actually needs the most help with, because it seems to be the most urgent problem, is housing? And whatever that the rest of the community can do to lend support to the city as it makes these pitches to senior levels of government is probably right now the most vital thing, or is it something else?
I would say yes. And with food being like all those other issues, mental health supports, mental health programs, addictions, all of those being like a really, really, really close second. But I do believe that having stable housing is the foundation, and no pun intended. The housing is the foundation for all of those other things to come together. And I do think that the private sector is looking for a way to be involved. And I think there are a lot, just like everything, there are a lot of things that there are a lot of people out there that want to help, but they don't know how to help. And I think that with the private sector development industry, they get a bad reputation that they're all about profits, but I've talked to some of them and they do want to help. Sorry, that's my phone. They don't necessarily have an answer on how to help, but they do want to help. It's frustrating though, because when we do get tools like we have from the provincial government around something like inclusionary zoning, it's frustrating when we get pushback from the development industry, not individual developers, but from the body that represents them. They push back hard on something like inclusionary zoning, because that will give us tools to mandate. If you build in this specific area, we can mandate that you include some affordable housing in that development. So the way private sector views helping and the way government views helping are two different things. I did talk to one developer who just wanted to build one big building of affordable housing or subsidized housing, and that is not necessarily where government is going or where policymakers want to go anymore. They don't want that kind of ghettoization. They want affordable housing mixed in with market rate housing as much as possible.
Yeah. And speaking just my own personal experience with the development industry, I understand what people think out there, but just from the last 2 years, for instance, last year, the food bank gave $1 million to the WISH program, which was the winter shelter program that the city was managing during that time to keep people from out of the cold and find them places to be in COVID, because a lot of the shelters weren't open. You know, it was just really difficult. But Jane and I were summoned to a number of different meetings from some of the key developers in town, and they ended up giving the majority of that $1 million to make it happen, and that they asked that they not be recognized.
Yeah.
Which I found kind of beautiful in its own way. You know, I mean, we think people like tooting their own horns, and we all do to a certain degree, but I think they realized at that point that the story really wasn't about them or their donations. The story was about COVID and the pandemic, and they didn't want to upstage that. And a number of them said that to us at different times. So I really agree with you. So now one more question before we go. When I was in Ottawa, I had 4 elections in 5 years. That's how bad it was. I mean, it was dislocating. It was very difficult. You know, I saw so much partisanship there and fighting from all parties. It was just really, really hard. And yet I went to Ottawa for 3 issues. One was poverty, obviously. 2 was international development and helping poor countries overseas to develop. And the third was women's issues. But in the course of doing that, you know, a new election would come, and then you'd have a new parliament, and then suddenly the old priorities just kind of melted away.
Yeah.
And we all had to summon it all, try to get it all back together again and make it go. And real strides were made. I think, especially on some of the Indigenous women things that we were working on. And it's frustrating when an election can come along and change that. We all know that that's part of the process, and that it's difficult. You and City Council and all of us are coming into an election pretty soon.
Yeah.
Right. And how do you feel about some of these initiatives? And I know it'll partly depend on who gets elected. But do you get frustrated, or do you feel that some of these things that we're prioritizing about right now, like housing, do you think that they will become part and parcel of the next council, or do you think there's a real chance we'll have to restart it all over again and see how we can do?
Well, the good thing about City Council is my first term of council, we implemented the 4-year budget as opposed to that annual budget. We do an annual update, so we do have to make tweaks every year, and a lot of it has to do with changes made at the federal and provincial level in legislation we have to respond to, things like that.
Yeah.
But in the 4-year budget that we passed just before COVID came in like crazy, we passed our budget, I think March 4th, and then we shut down in the middle of March. So we had put in at that point an historic level of funding for housing. We had just come out of a restructure and reorganization in our housing division. We had at the time 167, I think, units empty because they weren't getting repaired. And there were a bunch of things going on in the housing division that caused us to just completely restructure the entire thing. Yeah. And out of that restructuring came this big level of additional funding. So that's locked in there. And the way the 4-year budget works is it overlaps the change in term. So the first year of the next term of council is still the last year of our 4-year budget. So that is in there for good. I also think we have some really, really good staff at the city right now with Lynn as the city manager. Her focus is on these things because that's what she knows best. And so she understands the issues and the lay of the land. And so I always say that City Council gets credit or darts or whatever gets kudos or the opposite of kudos.
Goes with the territory. Yeah.
For the budget, right? We get both sides, and it really to a large degree is the staff. So City Council gets the draft budget that's being prepared by staff, and then we vote on it. We vote on it in, individual pieces, the overall budget, then the additional investments, and staff are very careful to separate the additional investments as recommended by staff or nice to haves, and the city needs to decide on that. I think I told you in our first talk that the budget around housing, they brought those additional investments, they had staff recommended, they had the nice to haves, and City Council approved almost all of them, if not all of them, even the nice to have. So that was new. And so I think we still have those staff, and yet even in housing, we have a much stronger staff, even now, it's just gotten stronger, and they are very dedicated, and they really are thinking outside the box. I think I had a long talk with Kevin Dickens after one very, very cold weekend not too long ago, where they had to bring out
Sorry, Kevin Dickens works with the housing part of the city, correct?
Yes, he's the deputy city manager in that division. Yeah. They brought in 2 London Transit buses overnight and parked them outside the church where the overnight resting spaces are taking place. But it was so cold, and there was so many people, and they had no place to put them. So they brought these 2 LTC buses. At that time, Omicron was raging, and so it was they quoted me in the paper as saying this perfect awful storm, because Omicron was raging, so there was a severe shortage of staff. So it's not a matter of just opening up spaces in a building somewhere, because there were spaces that could have been available to house people, but there was no staff to support them. So Kevin Dickens was calling everybody that he could think of, including social justice, social work professors at King's, asking them, do you have students who are looking for volunteer work? Do you have students who could, this is like at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, can you find some students to come and help out? So he was pulling out all the stops, and that's the kind of dedication that they have in that division right now, just looking for immediate solutions as well as, and especially, the long-term solutions. So I am confident that the focus on housing for sure will continue past this term of council.
Well, I think that, I think of years ago when climate change was coming along, and cities and other jurisdictions were it was kind of a peripheral issue. But it was inevitable that it would slowly creep forward over time and become a fundamental issue for all decision makers. Yeah. I think that poverty has become that as well. I mean, this series is called Food Bites, but it really is about poverty and how we tackle it. But it seems to me that homelessness now is now a relevant, upfront, front and center community issue. If the community doesn't handle it, it's not going to get handled. It's not a peripheral thing anymore.
Absolutely.
It's not just a few people sitting on the streets, and we saw them every once in a while. It's now become an infrastructure problem and needs to be dealt with. So we appreciate all that you've done on that. I mean, I've known you over the years since the mayor's panel, and I know you always stay on that, Maureen. But I'm really thankful to hear that some of these issues will continue on to the agenda, stay on the agenda. And when the next city council comes in, who's ever going to be on it, that because it won't go away. It's just maybe the biggest thing right now. We're going to have to deal with it. We appreciate all your efforts on that. And if you can think of more things that we as a public can do, or organizations to do, to help the city as it moves these things forward, we hope you'll let us know.
Thanks, Glenn. If you note, like, housing in particular, there's definitely a city aspect to that, but a lot of these problems that cities are tackling are not necessarily in our jurisdiction. And yet, I think you've seen over the years the success that happens when cities decide to take the reins. And so climate change is one. We declared that climate emergency, and I know people were saying, well, what's the point? This declaration, it's useless. There have been a lot of changes, including canceling the widening of Wonderland Road, because it's being looked at now through this climate emergency lens that the city staff have developed. Housing is the other thing. It's like, this is technically provincial jurisdiction to some degree, and the cities are taking the bull by the horns. I think the next thing that you're going to see, this is my prediction, is mental health. You're going to see cities say, nobody's doing enough. It's affecting us directly, and it's our citizens who are suffering. We're going to do something about it. And I do believe that cities are going to take that on.
Well, Maureen, thank you for all of that. I think I quite agree with you on the mental health piece, but we've got to move together as a civil society and a political representative part together. And hopefully we'll find ways of doing that as we move into the future. Thanks for doing this, Maureen.
Thanks, Glenn.